Welcome, everyone. Welcome again to the final month of the JUARA Wellness Webinar Series, actually. So really quick to announce that we have Dr. Ali Sharma. And for those of you, let me share this. For those of you who are new to the Wellness Webinar Series, welcome. We are talking about beauty inside out, and it's a mental health perspective during the COVID-19 pandemic with Dr. Ali Sharma, who is a clinical psychiatrist. And for us, for JUARA, we believe that beauty is not only skin deep, but it's a whole mind and body situation. So this is a perfect topic for us. A little bit about us. JUARA, we are a skincare, we're a beauty and wellness line inspired by Indonesian Jamu tradition. It's a 2,000-year-old wellness tradition that uses superfoods like kombucha, turmeric, tamarind, all these things that now are coming up as these like hot power foods. We've been having them in our sort of wellness traditions for thousands of years. We also focus not only on ingredients, but having enjoyable experiences. We believe in holistic wellness and community, and that deep social connections that foster listening, inclusivity, and a celebration of diversity is a core part of connecting with others, which is very much a part of health and therefore beauty. And of course, mindful rituals, having inspired and happy moments in your day. That is what living life is all about. A little bit of these webinars. Our objective is to connect with the community. Again, because beauty is not just skin deep, it encompasses our whole body. We want to feel connected to others so we can share our stories, share our knowledge, and just grow together and be stronger, better people, and to offer valuable content. So we've, as you will very soon see, we've got great resources and just great information and just great thought-provoking topics as well. And of course, it's a platform for presenters. So if you yourself know someone who could have something that would benefit others to listen and have an audience, we are a platform that can help. Today we have Dr. Ali Sharma, but also known as Ali. And what we're going to talk about today is addressing the dichotomy between how we feel on the inside and how we express on the outside. Because it's, you know, sometimes it's not like two perfect wheels in a car that are perfectly aligned. Sometimes it's a little jiggery. So how can we, so how can we recognize our inner vulnerabilities and recognize mental health issues that can manifest? So it's going to be a great dialogue of just, you know, just sort of thoughts and topics related to this. And of course, if you have any questions that just sort of trigger, then please feel free to just ask the question in the chat. I will be looking at it. And so the ongoing comments, please keep it rolling. It'll be great. And at the end, we'll share the contact information. So let's all get started and get started. So Dr. Ali Sharma, or I'm just going to call you Ali.
Ali.
I just wanted to introduce you to everyone formally, just kind of a little bit of your background before kicking off. You've been in public health for over 10 years and with a private practice and in Manhattan for over 10 years, which is quite a lot. And also, in addition to that, a creator and a founder of a podcast series, 2 of them. So we have Model Mentality and we have Coping with COVID-19 by Dr. Ali. And Model Mentality, we'll get into more of that. Actually, you know what? Since time is short, I'm just going to kick off to you and let you explain a little bit more about what, and when we say models, by the way, it's models like fashion models. So it's a series of interviews with fashion models and having a dialogue between what is sort of their mental states and how they are. And we'll kick it off to you, Ali. But of course, the first question is, what is a psychiatrist whose background is in public health with a private practice and 2 kids that you are also raising amazing? What are you doing in the world with like models and beauty and all that and podcasts?
So that's a great question. And before I answer that, I just first want to say it's an honor and a privilege to be here with you. I love your brand also and what you stand for. And the interesting thing is that perhaps how I may define beauty as a psychiatrist is actually very similar to how you in your industry defines it. And that's the fascinating cross-pollination between what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. So what is a clinical psychiatrist doing here? All right, so let's take a step back. Look, I think just to go into the personal for a second, I have always been a macro thinker. I was an economics and chemistry major in college. Later, I did a master's degree in social policy, in addition to being a psychiatrist, which is a physician. So I went to medical school and then did a deeper training in mental health. And look, for the last 10 plus years, I am a clinical psychiatrist. I've had a practice. I was an emergency psychiatrist at the beginning. I worked in a homeless shelter. I've done many things supporting people, who need our support. The people who need access to it can't have access to it. There is a profound level of stigma related to mental health conditions. Mental health issues are common, and unfortunately, the treatment strategies and our industry doesn't meet the needs. So we have this huge demand, and the services don't meet it. So one of the things I was doing was really thinking about the treatment gap, and that was the public health work. Okay, so fast forward, then I had 2 kids, and I had to, reconfigure the way I was working, both professionally and in the home. And one of the things that I personally have always loved doing is public speaking, even from a young age. Actually, at the age of 5, I felt like it was really easy for me, which I know is not a common experience. And I used to act and do other things. And so, as I had children and as my time became more important to manage and as I had to be more efficient, I started thinking about, well, how do I use my voice to talk about mental health and specifically to normalize the conversation? Because mental health is a part of the human condition. We all have experienced mental health issues, whether that's psychological distress to the more serious things, even stress. And so what I decided to do was go more on social media. And then I created these 2 podcasts, and we can talk a little bit more about the evolution of those 2. But why I'm here tonight is that, going back to the concept of beauty. So for me as a psychiatrist and as a fellow human being, I find so much beauty in people's vulnerability, the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to identify your own needs, to ask for help, and the ability to have that awareness and then transform to a different state. There is beauty in that. Now, I know there's also beauty about the exterior, but I find that there is an interplay between the internal and the exterior, and we can delve a little bit more into that, but that's a preview of why I'm here.
So what do you see right now currently, especially in these times in your practice with regards to, just to sort of set the stage, what do you see with people's internal mental situation?
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at the now. I mean, the now is the pandemic and a lot of things changing in our lives. So let's take a step back. I worked in post-conflict mental health, which is really thinking about collective trauma, war and conflict, and what that does across a society. So when I think about the pandemic and all of the things, the reverberating effects that happen as a result of it, such as obviously physical distancing. We all had strong social fabrics or a way that we operate, routines in our life that have been disrupted. If you look at the actual loss of life or the risks thereof that we have, and that's why we have to wear masks, to job loss and economic hardship. There have been a lot of changes over the last 6 months. And let's take a biological point of view. So as we know from maybe the animal kingdom, right? In times of your survival being threatened, what happens? You've probably all heard of the fight or flight response. And you've heard about adrenaline, right? So you're in jeopardy. What happens in your body? Adrenaline starts pumping and many other stress hormones like cortisol. And your body reacts, it speeds up, it protects, it fights or it flees. But look at the pandemic. In a way, our stress levels are consistently very high, especially because of the uncertainty of the times. And think about it, if that fight or flight response is getting activated or triggered on a daily basis or on a minute-to-minute basis or whatever capacity you're experiencing it, over time, your body's reserves are going to be depleted. And that's what a lot of people are feeling right now. So what I'm seeing are a lot of people who have never had experience with mental health issues that have maybe gotten the attention of a clinician, who are now experiencing anxiety, insomnia, subclinical depression, depletion, and just in general stress. And that is arising from what I just described. Now, there's a whole other bucket of people, those people who have had, let's say, pre-existing mental health issues or psychological distress for a variety of reasons. And I would say those who are in that category but are connected to care are working on themselves, right? Because they have providers and support around them. And as a general theme, what I am seeing is some people that I work with or speak to are actually feeling better in times of the pandemic. Let's just take an example for, I'm thinking of social anxiety. So those who might have anxiety in social settings or work settings are actually like, wait a minute, I get to work from home. This is actually great for my anxiety. Or other people might have an experience that has been described to me quite often. Actually, this is the first time in my life where I don't feel alone, because this is happening to everyone. It doesn't feel like it's just happening to me. And then there are others who are getting, triggered. Their symptoms are being exacerbated. The ones that I, have exposure to, we're working on things. And I would say then, just to move forward a little bit, let's just talk about coping, right? So what we're also seeing is maybe a use of what we would call as clinicians maladaptive coping mechanisms. So what do I mean by that? That's a complicated word, but a lot of people are smoking more, let's say tobacco products, Juul, cigarettes, cigars, alcohol as a coping mechanism to the stress I was talking about, or distress, marijuana, other illicit drugs, prescription pills, and all the way to overeating. That's also been a common thing that comes up as a way to cope, right? And so we're seeing a variety of mental health effects, and that I'm talking about the adult population, and then we have children, which is a whole nother subset, right? Not being in school, working from the confines of their home and trying to figure out how to operate in that ecosystem, but we as mental health practitioners, we know that mental health is actually maybe not anymore the hidden underbelly, but it is the other pandemic or the other epidemic. When this pandemic set in, I was hyper aware of all of what was to come and the importance of putting mental health at the top of the agenda. So that's also why I'm very excited to be speaking here today. It's an important topic to talk about.
So I'm curious, because stressors do come, what is specifically unique, you think, that's happening to people in this particular situation that is different? Like what's happening that's not usual stress?
Yeah, look, let's go back to the essence of what it means to be human. When we think about, let's say, interventions, I'm just going to bring up my past work life, interventions for a refugee camp or in times of war and conflict. The main interventions are actually like community interventions. So for mental health, we think about how to bring people together and how do we connect people so that people have a sense of purpose, community, and cohesion, right? Just to give you one example, well, look at what's happened, right? The interesting thing about this time with this virus is that we've had to disconnect from one another, but in so many ways. And I know you and I spoke about this, but I'll bring it up here. So let's just talk about work. So one of the things I think that probably people took for granted before the pandemic set in is the power of social support within the workplace that you go to more or less every day. There is, structured routine and perhaps, a support around knowing that you have the commute that you have every day and knowing that you rely on listening to the news during that time or reading something on your phone or listening to music and having a clear demarcation between work and home, right? And then you get to work. If you go to work, a lot of people obviously work from home already, before the pandemic set in, but if you go to work, you have your place where you sit and you have your interactions with your colleagues or the people in the building with which you work, and you may have casual conversations here and there. That is social support outside of the actual work environment. But then, of course, we have the home environment, which has been disrupted in various ways, depending on the configuration of the household. So that in itself, you take all of that away, and the absence of that starts to take a toll, right? At first, okay, we thought, oh, I didn't think it was 2 weeks, but 2 weeks, couple weeks, 6 weeks, and then we'll go back. But look, we see that this change has been sticking around, and that disruption of, I'm going to call, social fabric and our routines has an impact on our mental health. And it is hard to recreate that in the digital realm. I know we're all trying to do that and trying to have COVID teas, COVID connections, with our friends via Zoom, et cetera. But it is hard to recreate that in full. So I would say the social disconnectedness that we are experiencing is very counter to what we need in terms of our mental health and also in terms of being human. And, I think other examples in that are obviously there is loss of life due to COVID-19, but also the normal cycle of life and birth. And in a time where you can't support that in person, that's really hard, right? A grandparent who can't hold their grandchild, right? Or you lose a loved one for COVID or other reasons and you can't physically be there and adhere to the rituals that you usually would, right? Those things are counter to us and our normal routines of being human, right? So there's that piece. Now, I think there's the other piece, because it's required us to shut down so many parts of our society. Small businesses have closed, essential services have remained intact, but everything else is sort of quiet. There is obviously the economic piece, which is, change in your livelihood, economic hardship, and many people have had to pivot, right, which takes an enormous amount of energy in the way we're operating. But we know that in times where there are high rates of unemployment, there is a mental health impact, right? After the Great Depression, there was depression, right? So this pandemic really has changed our lives in so many ways that are unusual, I think, and just specific to a health crisis like this.
Well, it's so interesting because there's not much in terms of norms where it's like everybody's completely shut down, or it's not binary. It's a little bit of things that don't make sense. We're still working from home, but you're so right about the social component. That's kind of the pillar of what keeps us all human. So we have two questions. We have questions. One is, do you think there's going to be a long-term mental health effect from our social isolation during this pandemic, or will the effects mostly dissipate when people can actually be with others again?
So that's a great question. And I can't wait to see, as we track this in real time, like what we actually see from a research perspective. But if we go back to looking at, let's say, war and conflict as an example of a complex emergency, the WHO puts out information and others that, about 10% of people exposed to war and conflict will develop mental health issues that didn't have them before. But I think the good news is that most people are resilient through, let's say, a collective trauma like this. So we will feel acute stress and obviously prolonged stress through this. And some people will develop mental health issues. Most people will be okay. And I would say here, prevention is key. And this is why we're doing this webinar. It is so important, if you are feeling mental health effects and you don't have the supports in place, like a therapist or a provider or other healthcare practitioner, get help. Don't be afraid to do that, and think about it as health prevention, right? Because the truth is, if things are prolonged and your stress is prolonged, that can turn into things later downstream. But if you work on it now, it can really prevent a worse outcome. So that would be my public health message.
Okay. And, on the flip side, actually, to that, do you see long-term mental health impacts on people grieving the loss of loved ones when you can't have community funerals?
Yeah, so look, that is a really interesting and important topic to talk about. I don't know the mental health effects of that, but I do know that it is really important from a mental health perspective to be able to grieve the loss of loved ones. And actually, one of my podcasts, Coping with COVID-19, the 5th episode, I interviewed a death doula. And I don't know, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's someone who assists at the bedside, so to speak, in the whole process of death and end of life issues. And she specifically made a pivot quickly to virtual funerals. And it was really interesting because I think at the beginning of the pandemic, especially with COVID, but other family members passing, loved ones passing, people didn't know what to do. And so they were like, well, we can't see each other, so then we're not going to do anything. Actually, wrong answer. And it's a beautiful little episode to listen to. I think it's important for everyone to hear that actually there is power in commemoration, and that people need to grieve, and that you should just try to continue the same rituals that we have, but in a digital means. So she had a beautiful example of how, get together your family, have a time to commemorate, have someone play the music. Maybe someone plays the flute, have that person play the music, have another person, read a poem, have a tribute. We still have to carry on with things. Perhaps it's not the way we're used to grieving, in person and hugging and with our relatives, but there's still power in that connection. And of course it doesn't directly replace it, but it's a pretty good substitute.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, thank you for that question. That came from our audience. And this is might seem like a lighter question, but I do have to ask, when it comes to stress and dealing with all this, do you see any, and there may not be an answer, do men or women cope better? Is there
Yeah.
some kind
Okay.
of
The gender question.
the
So
gender question?
look, I'll answer it this way. There are what we call cultural idioms of distress, but people express distress in different ways. And that can vary across cultures. It can vary across genders. It can vary within a household. And I'm not going to go there because it's a very complicated answer. But there definitely is a possibility that people express stress differently and distress. So, and you probably, I mean, this is a question for the audience. Probably people have a lot of examples of how this manifests. I'm very aware of how that can take shape.
How much of it is, I mean, this is, we can just touch on and go real quick, but how many of these is really a biological thing, or is it a culture, is it more influenced by cultural norms and just living life and individual, it's that nature versus nurture kind of
Yeah, exactly. I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I think it is nature versus nurture. And there are studies looking at this. That could be a whole nother webinar or podcast. But yes, I think it's nature and nurture combination.
With one interesting comment from Alicia, funeral homes now also have virtual services available for families, available upon request. I just attended a virtual wake, and it certainly provided closure.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, and I'm so happy that you shared that experience. I think, look, I don't know about the audience who's here, but you know, if you think about the rituals related to grieving, right, and funerals vary across cultures and take many different shapes. And I think this is where we all have to be a little bit flexible and adaptable and try new things that feel strange, right? Because there is value in connecting this way. So I'm so happy for that comment.
Oh. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a great comment, a great question. So we're going to switch topics a bit. So we're going to, I have a question about taking things a little more personally. And if people can relate to this, please feel free to comment on it. Just as we're talking about beauty and inside and outside, of course, for me, I think about, you know, the way I feel on the inside versus the way I'm presenting on the outside. So what would you say, like for me, I feel the stress of having to almost be more presentable because now we live in a Zoom filled world. So I'm constantly on screen all the time and everything is virtually happening constantly. And I'm finding myself having to, because it is just very specific, you know, for happy hours, for work meetings, with vendor meetings, and the faux pas to have the video on, the video off. What do you do? There's kind of a sense where there's a pressure to look presentable, which makes me kind of think more about the way I'm coming off and appearing. I don't know if other people can relate to this sudden, almost like focus on you and your face. But what would you suggest some thoughts, or like, why am I feeling this way? Or what are some things you could talk to that to address that sort of pressure?
Sure. Okay. So if we look at the conversion from, let's say, working as usual, let's presume that's an office setting, right? Where there's a lot of in-person, face-to-face meetings, a different way of functioning, some conference calls, et cetera. And then we go to the now, which it really has converted to entirely video, entirely Zoom. Look, I was already used to doing Zoom, so I had a way of managing my platform. But I would say one material difference, which a lot of people aren't even really addressing or thinking about, is Zoom is not a normal face-to-face interaction, depending on the way you configure your screen. And I'll tell you why. When you're in the office and you're talking to someone, do you have a visual on you? No. But when you're on Zoom, you have a visual on you while you're talking to someone. And that can be such a distraction. And I notice people, oftentimes when I get on screen with someone for a call, people are like, oh my God, my hair, I look so bad. But when I'm in person, would that ever happen? No, because people can't see themselves. So look, I learned that early on because I was doing some telework in my practice, and I learned to minimize my screen so that I'm all the way over here and I don't see myself, so I'm not distracted by that. You know, and I think that is the material difference between, you know, working in person and working with Zoom. Now, you described some other things, like always feeling like you have to be on. And I guess I would ask you a question. Now versus being in the office, what's the difference in the quality of that, right? Because I imagine even in person, you probably always had to be on your, you know.
You know what I realize is Zoom and versus in real life. In real life, you can talk to someone and then just be like, "Uh-huh, I'm listening to you." And it's actually not uncommon, but notice how it looks a little weird that I'm not looking at you. So there's no break. It's literally you have to be on even in happy hours it just because you see everybody's Brady Bunch faces that if you're the one that's kind of like, "Excuse me," I mean, that looks weird. you know?
Right. So actually there's like, it's the immobility of the interaction in a way. And I recognize that, right? Because you're sitting usually in a chair facing forward and people notice if your eye contact is diverted for a second, right? The other person can react, well, especially obviously as a therapist, people, taking note of that. But yes, and that probably requires a sustained amount of energy. And also then there's always staring at a screen and technology, which we know has an impact, right? That's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, it can be exhausting. And so I think on multiple levels, Zoom does complicate things. However, I would say there's still a variety of reactions. Some people love this work from home setup, including being at home in their physical space and working on Zoom. And then others are really struggling with the Zoom time. So there's still a lot of variability.
Interesting what you say about just having an awareness of the little things that might be triggering micro stresses that I, maybe know but not so aware of, which then ends up into this whole like, oh my gosh, I feel like there's so much pressure to perform, but it's really like, oh, I'm making sure that my head is 3/4 up on the screen, that I'm looking this way, and it could be all these little things that I probably am not paying attention. In the normal world. But so that's really interesting because that's the whole topic of just being aware of what the micro differences are that's creating sort of a little bit of friction between inside and out. Interesting. I had another question for you.
Sure.
This is relating to just what I hear a lot from other people, men, a lot of them women really though, but this sense of feeling like a failure in these times where we're doing the best we can, but the mom, working woman, now teacher, homeschooler at the same time, feeling like being pulled in a lot of directions and still having to be a strong figure in the family and whatnot, but actually feeling like you're not doing very well in any of that.
Okay, so this is a very important topic. And look, I want to say something to if there's any parents out there, working parents who are listening right now. First of all, you are doing an amazing job. You are doing the best that you can, and that is good enough. And these times are really hard. I'm also a parent. I have 2 young children. And when I'm in my practice, I have to be on. I can't have disruptions, although my kids have Zoom bombed my sessions. It's kind of funny. But look, it is very difficult right now. And I think depending on the configuration of your household, especially a working parent, who's managing the education of their children. At the same time, they're managing how to cook the meals, how to take care of the laundry, how to clean the house, with no help at home. It's really, really difficult. And I would say that right now, these are unusual times. So I would say that feeling of failure, if you can work to counteract those feelings of failure with more positive thoughts, like, you know what, I may feel like a failure, but I'm actually not, because the circumstances and the environment in which I'm operating is extremely stressful and extremely challenging. And it's really about the stress and the unusual nature of what we're going through that is what's kind of triggering my feelings of failure. But, I always like to, in clinical practice, I always like to talk about like fear of failure versus like actually the evidence of the failure, right? And in this situation, and I'm going steps further than I would in a therapy session, but in this situation, right, these are the circumstances that are putting us under undue stress. And that can trigger things within us and negative thoughts. But I would say if not you, Meta, but if one is experiencing negative thoughts and those thoughts are consuming and they're not going away and they're dragging you down and they're affecting your ability to function, then that is a sign that you should go talk to someone about it and seek help, because that needs to just be looked at carefully and you don't have to live like that, right? I think getting support around that is really important.
When is it, what would you say, is a good heuristic to know when this is due stress versus undue stress. The moment you actually go, I actually do need to go talk to someone, unwind, because sometimes it's not waiting until you get to 110% of yourself, before you kind of go, I just need it. And then the next thing you know, you're 3 bottles of wine and you're like,
Yeah, exactly. No. So, okay, few indicators. So you mentioned bottles of wine. So if you notice that your alcohol intake or the maladaptive coping mechanisms are a little, going beyond what is good for you and what is healthy, that's a sign, right? To maybe examine yourself and get some help. There's a couple of other indicators. I think energy is a good one. Like if you're finding that your energy is so low that it's starting to interfere with you being a productive person as usual, right? So your ability to work, your ability to take care of your children, like if it's really becoming harder, that's a sign to get help. I would say if your concentration is starting to become less clear, but it's starting to impact your work, that's a reason to get help. And then sleep. Sleep is just a good indicator of mental health, right? So if sleep is disrupted, that is a great sign that something deeper might be going on, that the stress is starting to, let's just say, bubble over into a very important part of our life, which is to rest. And so that's another reason to get help. Those are basic key indicators. Obviously, there's many more symptoms that could arise.
Sleep is a really interesting point because I know my circadian rhythm is definitely off, and we kind of joke like we are like half of us who are natural vampires are. I have a very consistent 3 a.m. sleep time at this point that sometimes ekes to 4. Now, but is there something to the circadian rhythm or people's sleep that physiologically actually affects mood and energy?
Yeah. So look, what we see in clinical practice is if your sleep pattern, your normal sleep pattern is disrupted and over a longer period of time, people's mental health starts to get a little bit more difficult, right? In terms of sometimes anxiety can come up, the concentration issues I mentioned, depletion. And I think, when you think about good sleep hygiene, right, there's certain kind of basic tenets around it. So first, a lot of people are drinking more coffee too in the now. So what is your caffeine intake? Are you drinking caffeine after, let's say, noon or 3 p.m.? And maybe thinking about cutting back on that, because we know caffeine can, increase the possibility of sleep disruption, but also anxiety, right? Because it's a stimulant. So other things, what are you doing at night? Are you finding ways to, kind of like take it down a notch from your day, or are you on your smartphone, looking at social media and reading the news and activating yourself? Exercise is obviously an important part of sleep hygiene. Having a nice sleep space is really important, like conducive to resting. And there's many other things to consider, but if you do all of those things and it's still there, right? Anxiety could be the reason that sleep is difficult, and many other possibilities. It has to be looked at with a healthcare provider if you can't figure it out yourself. And then some people have chronic sleep issues, and there's medical reasons for sleep issues. So it does require a comprehensive evaluation if it's really an issue.
Well, I went, part of my Amazon shopping binge included a new pillow because it was
Important.
I want a pillow. And speaking, and I also had another thought in terms of just sort of the way we're behaving and kind of really going on this internal external dichotomy, judginess. There's so much stuff in the news in terms of like, wear a mask, don't wear a mask. I think it would be uncontroversial to say that we live in slightly polarized times. Not only is it uncertain, but it's uncertain. So they have their own opinions, they have their own conclusions, so through their own upbringings, no judgments there. But sometimes I feel there's and I'm sure it's not just me, but I'm sure there's people that feel a pressure to behave a certain way, to give off a signal. It's almost like virtue signaling that we're doing the right thing, for fear that we may be looked upon as uncareful or too paranoid, whatever it is. And it's an interesting friction between like my set of rules and how I function and my logic versus what we think other people might feel. Like, I'll give you a wild example, and I'll just put it out there as judge me if you want to. I was with a friend, and we were out in a restaurant, a very safe space. It was in the open, it was in the outdoors, and this was a couple weeks ago. And we had our foods. We took off our masks, and this is before the restaurants opened. It was just outside the city. Certain restaurants were open. and we took a selfie. And right before I took it, I was like, oh, before we post anything, let's make sure we have a mask like in the picture or the chin strap thing. And it was just so we don't look like we're being irresponsible because someone's going to think so. And I was kind of laughing, like, I can't believe we've kind of gotten to a point where I'm having this, conversation in my head. It was sort of, kind of a joke, but at the same time, like, no, seriously, like there is this sense of, how do I make sure that my colleagues don't think at work that I'm being unsafe by doing blah, 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 or just even having that conversation. It's almost a bit destabilizing for an otherwise pretty confident human being who doesn't question their own actions.
Okay. So yeah, there's a lot in what you said. So let's break it down a little bit. So look, I guess first it's understanding, like, at the individual level, where do you stand? And we know there are political ramifications, and that's a whole other discussion. But it sounds like in that example you provided, you are being careful, you are wearing a mask, but you are worried that that action of taking that picture and putting it on social media, perhaps, would elicit a response, which was actually not in line with your thinking or the individuality of what you feel about wearing a mask. And then I would say something further, which some people may be sensitive to that judgment, but others may not, right? So that's where there is so much variation at the individual level in terms of like what things deeply trigger us, what things we're sensitive about. And, perhaps that is your sensitivity, and that would be something you could explore internally. But I think you're speaking to an important thing, right? Because in our Zoom culture, in our social media culture, a facade or a side of us gets put out there, right? And then there's that potential for judgment. That doesn't mean that's all facets of us. And, if those values are really important to you, it's important to set the frame so that you can avoid that conflict of judgment, right? So, for example, I've seen a lot of CEOs of fashion brands and, other business people posting, pictures of themselves without a mask, but they have a disclosure line. Like, this was posted, I had my mask on, but for the picture, I took it off, right? To indicate to others their values, right? And to avoid the judginess that you're speaking about. Now, similarly, let's say you work in a work from home environment where maybe other people are running around in the background. You have roommates, for example, and you know that maybe people are unmasked and your work colleagues might be wondering, like, what's going on in your home? But you might want to set the stage for what's happening in your interactions. And, that's like a work environment question. But like, if you have something that could be questions, just tell your colleagues, like, look, if you see this is my situation at home, just know that this is where I stand. And it's about framing the expectations, and therefore people won't make assumptions. That's one example. There's so many ways to look at this. But I think it's an intensely personal, maybe, example that you're bringing up of one's reaction to a situation, especially, and sensitivity to being judged.
Mm-hmm. So basically, you're saying to set the tone of kind of your own standards and making your stance known so that there's less vagueness for the pinging back and forth, the peeping, assuming, and you reacting to an assumption, and
exactly.
Prevent all that, just kind of be much more clear and be more transparent, which again goes back to being aware about where you stand, which is, yes. I hear that is quite the theme of just be aware of where you're at.
Exactly. And I'll give you one more example, which I know we started to talk about. So look, one of the things that, I talk about with people in my practice and others is like the pandemic is not going away, and especially in the United States, and we need to prepare ourselves for the long game. Right. So what does that mean? We talked about social support. Social support is so critical, for our internal lives, for external lives, for mental health. And so I'm encouraging people to think about, if you have been isolated, who can you partner up with? Who's in your COVID bubble? I posted a little bit about that on social media. But also part of that, because of the risks that we're all exposed to and the uncertainty, part of that is managing the expectations of your little social unit, right? So what are your values? What are you comfortable with? What is the level of risk that you're okay with in your community or your, let's say, germ circle, versus the people that you might include in your little bubble? And I'm telling people, like, I think it's really important, if you have a group of people you hang out with, talk about the exposure risk and what you're going to do in terms of communication around it. Let's say if someone is positive for the virus, how are you going to manage that, and agree upon a plan? In the same light, think about testing. For example, we have someone helping with the kids here, and that person is in an area where the rates were high, so we've agreed upon a testing frequency. But it requires knowing what your view is, which means awareness of your fears, and also then maybe coupled with a risk assessment and some science, and then coming to a decision, and then coming up with a plan. And often that kind of management, let's say, of risks related to this health crisis, can really help with mental health and anxieties, right? As long as there's a crisis plan in place or a plan to mitigate risk, that often makes people feel better, right? Or at least you have something to go to in times of uncertainty. And that is, again, like what we're talking about, that is like knowing your internal and then the expression of the external, which I know we'll get into.
Which is actually perfect time, because I was going to say, we're, the last part, this is great. We're doing great in terms of time, because this is a very important part, which I want to ask. How would you give us sort of just tips and advice and suggestions? What can we add to our toolkit to be able to balance our internal world and internal health, so we can then have an external expression that's very congruent with basically however we're feeling on the inside?
Sure. So that's a great question. I like to think about it in three parts. So the first is awareness. The second is expression, and the third is integration of all of that. So I'll talk about what that means. So let's start with the first. Look, as a mental health practitioner, I have learned the value in working on one's emotional health and how that can have reverberating effects. But it really starts with being aware of your own internal experiences. And look, that can be a process for some people. Some people are already there, right, and have that awareness. Some people, have layers and layers and layers of defenses, and it might take some time and work. But finding the stillness and the space to be aware of how you feel is really important. So little exercise, just take a deep breath right now and exhale, and just notice how you're feeling. You can close your eyes, you can keep your eyes open, but how are you feeling inside? Have that stillness and honor that moment. And that's just a small exercise, and that can be expanded, but it's really finding, and understanding yourself and what you're experiencing. And look, there's a lot of means to get there in our busy lives or in times of stress. How does one get there? Meditation is a great way to do that. And the caveat there is a lot of people can't access that actually because their head might be too full or cluttered. So I would say then find a virtual facilitator for meditation, right? Like Calm or Headspace, which is free for, I think, all Americans, for example, are two great examples. And if you can't do that and you still can't access it, then what I tell people is, just when your household is quiet, light a candle, lay down in your bed or on your couch, stare at the ceiling for 5 minutes and do nothing, right? And find the stillness. And it's okay if you schedule that in, because sometimes it does take that. It takes prioritizing having that space to have the stillness, to start to have access to your emotions. So that's one. And look, exercise is another way to get there. Therapy is another way to get there. Meditative exercises like walking, swimming, jogging, biking, those are all great ways to try and create the space to access that. Okay, so that's the first piece. Now the second is expression. So once you figure out how you feel, there is power and therapeutic value in expressing how you feel, in saying out loud and talking to someone about it, or perhaps journaling about it. And I think this is something that we as mental health clinicians, we see. Many of us go to our own therapy when we start training, or we've been in therapy before, and then we are therapists. And I can't tell you time and time again how someone will say, oh my gosh, thank you. I feel so good in just saying it, right? And just getting it out of my body. So you might even have the awareness and it's in you and you're like, I know what's going on, but actually getting the energy out metaphorically, kind of like, it's like releasing steam, right? Or the metaphor I like to use is imagine a boiling pot of water, right? That has a lid on top. Keeps boiling. What happens over time? The lid is going to blow, right? But if you have a pressure cooker that lets off steam, right? It's never going to have that explosive effect. It's good to, let the energy off, the emotional energy off. That's just an abstract way of thinking about it. But that's the expression. And there are many ways of expressing oneself, right? It depends on your leanings and inclinations. But I really would recommend trying to speak it, right? And you could speak it out loud to yourself. I know that may seem silly, but really there's power in connection with someone else listening, someone else who can validate what you're going through and can just say, I understand. I'm here to listen, and if you can find a sparring partner or a therapist to do that, I think there's power in getting the emotions that you're experiencing out. And then the final stage, and this is more complicated than this, but is integration. So once you're aware and you can express it, then how do you integrate that awareness into your life so that you're fluid, right? So that dichotomy the amplitude is lower, right? Meaning what you experience on the internal is easily expressible with the external and fluid, right? And there's an interplay.
So if you can't, just a specific question, if you don't have access for whatever reason to a person to speak to, or if you're like, writing is not my communication medium, do other activities like movement, like dance or singing, does that substitute as well, or not quite the same way?
So I'm biased. I think you can express yourself. I think you can find substitutes. And I think, that is a personal journey for everyone, right? Some people express themselves through art, through dance, through movement. And I would just say that you'll know when you feel that you're able to get it out of your body, right? So if movement does get you there, then do that. If art gets you there, then do that. If singing, which is very powerful, singing gets you there, do that. If humming gets you there, do that. So, but I would say it's what won't get you there is the suppression of those emotions. That won't get you there.
Oh, okay. Well, do you have any, now that we're entering into the new norm, sort of creating your own space, do you have any thoughts on how to help proactively shape our world around us, our own world?
Yeah. So look, one of the things I am telling people from a mental health perspective is now that we know that this pandemic is not going away, or it's not gone away yet, to prepare for the future, right? To prepare and structure your life so that you are ready, right? And that could be the thing as simple as I spoke about, which was preparing your COVID bubble. Like, who's going to be your social supports? If rates are surging, but you do need to see people that you trust, who's going to be your small support system, and what is the plan around that? How are you going to exercise? Movement is so critical, right? In this work from home environment where there's no commute and we're not moving, how are you going to move? And look, I've told people, like, think about innovative things like that we wouldn't do otherwise. Think about a little bike underneath your desk. Think about investing in used equipment at home. Get weights. There's so many wonderful people out there doing free Instagram videos, training videos. Nike training app I heard is really good. Of course, there's then the Peloton and all the bikes that you can rent for a nominal fee every month. But figure out an exercise regimen. And I would say alongside of that, think about meditation or the creation of this space to process what you're going through, whatever that means for you. And then I think if you are working from home and really have been doing it sort of haphazardly and adapted quickly, set up your space at home as if it is the only office you'll ever have again, right? Because we're probably in this for the long game. We don't know how long this is going to go on. Some people are going into work, but create a beautiful work environment. And I know there's a lot of challenges around that. I mean, I live in New York City and people have small apartments and we don't have a lot of space at home. But, even if you're working from your bedroom in a corner, what can you do that sets you up for an optimal environment in terms of wellness and productivity? Think about ergonomics, think about beautiful things around you, a plant, whatever it is that you need to do it now and just make that investment. I think it can go a long way. And then, the final thing, children, that's a really tough one. And there's a lot right now being talked about. There was a lot on NPR today, and in the New York Times, there was an article. That is one of the hardest things. And, my go-to is again social support, but finding other families or a setup that works for you and your household. And that this is a complicated discussion, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who have stories, and I have my own story, but make sure it's set up in a way that allows some flexibility so that you can manage as best as you can. It is not going to be perfect, and I think parents are doing a great job and they're doing as best as they can, but finding support around this is key.
I have a tip for anyone out there who wants safe candles. I actually, in my home, when I wasn't sure when restaurants were going to open again, for me, I was obsessed. And I turned one of my rooms in my house like a little lounge restaurant. And so just on Amazon, I got these candles that I can turn off by a remote control. They're like $24 for a dozen. So it's amazing how just having those, and it's like danger free. I don't have to burn my house down. But you're right. It's so amazing how just creating a space that's like a special space, a celebration space. I'll even tell my housemate, come on, I want to eat in tonight. Let's go eat at the restaurant. And so we've created this little space for us to actually just, sure, it's just a room in the house, but it is something special and nice, and it does. It's relaxing. It's quite rejuvenating, actually. And it's really effective. It's amazing. Once we put our mind into saying we are creating a special space with that intention, that it actually feels special, and I react to it as if it is truly a special place. So
exactly. And another simple example with kids, like what I often do is like we'll have meals in different places in our house, like, and I'll set up a picnic. So we're having a picnic in this room today, and here's dinner, and we change it up. And I think they love it. It's just something to vary, something that's hard to vary, right? And it is about creativity. I agree.
Yeah, oh, it's true. Well, we are close to out of time, and I want to make sure that we actually share a little more about your awesome podcasts that you're doing. So I wanted to share with everyone. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was, it's always a joy, and that was amazing. That was just so much food for thought that is just kind of insightful.
It's my pleasure.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know we can probably talk for hours, and probably will after this. Yeah. But in the meantime, so if you want to, for the rest of you, if you want to hear more from Dr. Ali Sharma or from Allie, please, please, please check out her podcasts. Here it is. It is on mindstudios.com. Allie, if you want to share a little bit about what your two podcasts are, specifically the model mentality and coping with COVID, that would be great.
Sure. So I've been working on model mentality with my co-host, Bridget Malcolm, who is a fashion model from Australia, but she works internationally. And we had been recording since 2019, and we're about to launch in March 2020. Of course, COVID came, so we went on pause. And because we had the podcasting skills, I'll talk about the other one first, we pivoted to coping with COVID-19 by Dr. Ali. And so we'll start there. So I started interviewing people from around the globe, different walks of life, to really start to share stories about how the pandemic was impacting people, from the frontline ER worker to a restaurateur to the death doula I mentioned. And I've done 32 episodes so far. And I have a little segment that I narrate at the end called Let's Get Clinical, which then is like the spin on my takeaways as a psychiatrist or a psychological being about what I find significant. And then we finally in July, we launched a curation of model mentality episodes. Obviously we've been in sensitive times, right? Both with the pandemic and then with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we were very careful in selecting what might be, good to start with. So we have 4 episodes out, and the idea is that we interview fashion models, right, who are often, in social media, they have platforms, and there's often a over focus on the external, of course, because that's what they do for their living. But they are opening up about their mental health experiences, from gender transitions to depression, to anxiety, to bipolar disorder, to substance abuse, to domestic violence. There's many stories, and it's been a very powerful process for me to work with Bridget and interview people who are willing to go public with their stories. And that's where the Let's Get Clinical idea really came to life. So, model mentality is the interview of the guest, and then I narrate the Let's Get Clinical segment, and I talk about their story within the context of the larger mental health, experience and mental health care and what's available. So those are my 2 podcasts, and then I put them in this platform, Mind Studios, which is a mental health platform. And there's, we have lots more ideas to come, but that's where we are at the moment. So please listen, and if you like it, please rate and review us. We'd love to hear from you, and I would appreciate the support. And for me, the main thing around this is public health for me, right? This is about education and advocacy of something that traditionally has been very hidden and stigmatized. So I'd love to, if you can help me get the word out there, I'd be so appreciative.
That would be great. And again, that's model mentality and coping with COVID. 10, oops. 19. And up next, we have Thursday, August 27th, we have on a completely different topic, but still related to wellness, is how to foster cyber wellness in an online era. I'm really excited to have our guest, Jay Schneider. He is a cybersecurity and technology expert, but specifically also a dad of twins. And so he's been going through this whole shifting of just technology, not only in the workplace, but it is now literally his whole life. So it's great. It's going to be about how to stay secure, just on the basic stuff, how to make sure that things are safe, just every question that you kind of have in terms of what's secure, what's not secured, my data, how our kids going to get into our computers, just the wellness aspect of just how to manage yourself as you have a lot of more screen time, and just how to, again, keep it balanced, so you're in balance, and I'm just going to call it staying sane as a short term. If you want to present, if you could just go to our website, on our blog page, on our website, there's actually a form that you can fill out to give us your information, and then we can contact you again, because again, this is offering a platform for the community to connect with each other. So please, speaking of connecting, connect with us. Lots of contact numbers, but yes, so with Allie, we've got the Mind Studios NY and the mindstudios.com for this great podcasts, and just Allie Sharma, MD, and your website. Thank you, everyone. And we'll also have all this contact information that we'll be sending out in the follow-up, because I know it's a lot of links to all of you. So I just want to say thank you again, Allie. That was great. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone.
For the conversation. I really loved it, so.
Definitely. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. And that's all we got tonight for you, and hope to see you on our next webinar. So stay safe, be well, be happy, and be healthy, everyone. Good night, y'all.